Welcome back to another episode of Hot Air, and we are sticking with the Pride Month goodness. As you may or may not be aware, since the new administration took over the White House and made it even whiter than you possibly could have ever imagined, and, dare I say, straighter, which means far more boring. And a little bit more crazy. But there's been a lot of things that have been on my mind. A lot of questions I have in regard to executive orders, marriage equality. I'm like, are they just going to overturn gay marriage? You know, I am not very educated when it comes to the legalities of the government system. That's probably not even a sentence that is proper English. So I thought I would call in for some reinforcement. And I'm joined today by my very smart friend, and we are going to get into the legalities of it all. Marriage equality, DEI, trans rights, the friggin' rollbacks of trans rights, HIV and AIDS research, just all the things that we're seeing stripped away from us and how that can even be possible. It blows my mind. So let's hit it. Seeing is overrated. All right. Ready, Freddy? Well, Maria, welcome to Hot Air.
Hi.
I think you're my first gay guest.
Really? Wow.
Yes.
How long have you been discriminating against gay people? I'd love to know.
Since the day I was fucking born. It's
so
all of
she's
my
a
internalized
self-hating queen.
homophobia, yes. So I had one male guest and he was straight. So you're my first gay,
Well,
which
I appreciate
I'm like,
the diversity.
it only took 12 episodes to get here. How embarrassing for me. But before we get into all of the wonderful things that I would like to talk about today, why don't you introduce yourself, tell me and the listeners a little bit about you, your background, your education, because you are a smart boy and I can't wait to pick your smart brain.
I don't know about smart. We'll see. Maybe I've got a smart mouth, but that's pretty much it.
That too.
So a little bit about me. I'm from, Texas, from Dallas to be specific, born and raised. I'm the child of immigrants, and I'm the first in my family to graduate high school. And now I work as a lawyer. So I kind of went through a long journey to get there, but I've been practicing for about 8 years now. I primarily practice what's called white-collar criminal defense and investigations work. So I represent like celebrities and high-net-wealth individuals in legal matters, typically criminal ones, but some civil stuff too. Most of my stuff is federal. And I went to Harvard Law School for undergrad. I went to Western Kentucky University. And for business school, I did like a 1-year stint, but didn't get a degree because business school wasn't for me, in Mexico City. So I've kind of bounced all over the place and seen a little bit of everything,
I love that. Any murders?
No, I did do some volunteer work at a public defender's office, and there were 2 clients that were, accused of murder. So that was different. Most of my stuff is nonviolent, but every now and then I will, step into something like that. So It's interesting. It's different.
Yeah. Nonviolent is good. And I didn't realize, well, I knew you went to Harvard, but I didn't really realize you went to Harvard until I went down the rabbit hole on your TikTok the other day. And I was like, oh shit, he's like top tier, very smart boy. So that's cool.
Hard?
Not right. Okay. Not everyone can go to Harvard. God,
I'm kidding.
I always think about that and I'm like, I didn't even go to school after high school. I left and I was like, no more, I can't do anymore. And anyone who goes to school, let alone like Harvard, I'm like, get on with your bad self.
I don't blame you one bit. Like I said, I'm the first in my family to take that path, and it's not for everybody. So I respect whatever you're doing as long as you're passionate and happy with it.
Well, thank you for your support. All right, so the meat of the topic today, we're gonna get into. Obviously, there's a lot going on politically, but that aside, I've been really nervous lately about just gay marriage being overturned or some wild turn of events, and then I tried to kind of put that on the back burner in my brain for a little bit, and then seeing, trans rights being taken away and all of these executive orders that kind of trickle down, some of them directly affect the LGBTQ plus community, and some I don't think we're quite aware of how much they're going to affect us just yet. So I kind of wanted to just start out with the threat to gay marriage, because I am married to a man, and my green card is reliant upon that marriage staying valid for a certain period of time. And, with ICE coming through San Diego and LA and all the riots and things that are happening right now, protests turning into riots, I'm like, is ICE going to like show up at my door and be like, nope, no more green card? Or like, those things go through my head when I'm trying to sleep at night. But so this week I was listening to a podcast, and I keep trying to pronounce this correctly. Obergefell v. Hodges. For some reason I want to be really German with it and like say Obergefell crazy. But I was listening a little bit to that, and that was, the Supreme Court case that allowed us in 2015, I believe, to get married, same-sex couples. So after listening to that, they brought up a really good point that although we can marry in the country as a whole, we don't get the same marriage equality when it comes to people not allowing us to have cakes from their store, or maybe a photographer doesn't want to work with us, or a venue doesn't want to work with us based on the fact that we are a same-sex couple. So I found that really interesting. And then that's when my wheels started turning, and I was like, how easy would this be to overturn? And, we never thought that Roe v. Wade would kind of flip the script on us. So like comparing Roe v. Wade to Obergefell v. Hodges, like what is the likelihood of something like that happening to Obergefell v. Hodges, the right for us to marry?
Yeah, that is such a great question, and I feel you as somebody who's also married. And I want to emphasize one thing before we talk about this. A lot of people refer to it as marriage equality, and I like that framing, because the reality is that Obergefell held that you couldn't discriminate against LGBT people who wanted to get married as well. So it wasn't about creating a separate right. We're not a separate right. It was about treating everybody equally, which I think most Americans agree with. And so I just want to emphasize that. But your fear is a total real one, right? We have all sorts of things changing today. But like Obergefell is the Supreme Court precedent, and you're 100% right. Like we've seen that happen before with Dobbs v. Jackson's Women's Health and how that turned out. So the fears is totally not something absurd. It's just a very complex one to get to. And so for that to happen, there are definitely a few steps that need to take place, but there is some kind of foreshadowing happening that we should be concerned about, frankly. And so I'm glad you're talking about this. I hope your listeners are really interested in this topic, because it's funny, once we achieve that as like a movement for the LGBT folks, I feel like all the momentum stopped. And it's funny that people would stop, because there's still so many other rights that we don't have full access to. And even this, like you mentioned, right? Like it's got these holes in it. You can deny people service for a cake for their wedding. You don't have to build them a website. It'd be shocking to go through that experience as a person despite having that right. So your fear is a valid one. And what would that look like? It would look just like Dobbs, basically. But there are a few extra steps. So it's kind of easier to understand how it would happen by understanding how we got there, because you can see those steps and then you basically reverse engineer them. So a while back, we had this big, statute in the U.S. that was passed by Congress, the federal level, and it was called the Defense of Marriage Act, or DOMA is what people call it to it. Did you ever hear about that law back in the day? Yeah, right. So it said you couldn't recognize LGBT, marriage equality on a federal level at all. So there was a lawsuit went all the way to the Supreme Court called United States versus Windsor, and that invalidated that law. And once that happened, it went back to the states, right? Similar to what happened with Dobbs, right? So we lost Roe v. Wade, and it goes back to the states. But at the time, obviously, there were a lot of states who still had their own bans, whether that was a law or their constitution for the state, because states have their own constitutions. There were these different kind of patchworks throughout, the nation. And that stayed that way for a while until Obergefell happened. And Obergefell said, now it doesn't really matter what state you're in, you cannot discriminate and prohibit people from entering marriage no matter what state it is in. And that opened it nationwide, all right? So there's a few different steps. Do you remember Kim Davis, the woman with the really bad roots, really angry looking? She was a law clerk in Kentucky. Did you ever hear about her?
No.
So
not bad roots.
Yeah, girl, it was bad. But basically, she was this clerk who worked at the county office, and she said, I'm not going to, recognize any LGBT marriages, even after Obergefell, even after the Supreme Court said, you have to follow this law. She said, no, I'm going to do the illegal thing. I'm going to break the law. And to this day, literally a decade later, she's still back in court because she's been refusing people licenses.
Oh, God.
And so that's the kind of thing that would eventually go up to the Supreme Court. It's those kinds of cases. And what she's arguing is like, it's against my religious belief. And then you have these two rights conflicting. You have the marriage equality, and you've also got somebody's religious expression, right? And so you would have to reverse Obergefell, but that wouldn't be it. It would be just like Dobbs, right? Like it would be returned to the states. And then some of those states, similar to what we saw with Dobbs, with Roe v. Wade, is some of these states have, laws on the books that have never actually been formally repealed. But because of Obergefell, they're basically invalid. They're unconstitutional. So those would suddenly wake up, just like we saw these, anti-abortion laws that woke up from like 1848. All of a sudden, we would have these bans in some of these states that would revive. But we do have like a small wrinkle here, which is something new. 2022, we passed at a federal level, the Respect for Marriage Act. And so the Respect for Marriage Act says that if one state gives somebody a lawful marriage, this other state has to recognize it. But it gives exceptions for religious things, okay? So it does say like, nonprofits that are religious affiliated, they don't have to actually perform those ceremonies, but you can't prohibit somebody from accessing that governmental certificate, right? And so what you would do is you'd return to the states, but the Respect for Marriage Act would federally say, if you get married in one state, you have to recognize it in another. And that would mean that everyone would go to those states like California or Massachusetts, where it was legal back when it was a state's issue, right?
Right.
And so you would also need to get rid of that. They would either need to repeal it, or there would need to be some court challenge to it to say that's unconstitutional, and it would basically be like a reverse Windsor. So it's a lot of steps to get there, but it is absolutely as plausible as Roe v. Wade is. So it's a realistic fear.
Great. That sounds fun and positive, and I just can't wait. So I always wonder, because I don't know a lot about United States law or government, because I grew up in Canada, and I also don't even remember, and I'm a homosexual, so and up until recently I didn't give a shit. Now I definitely am trying to learn and care. But what is preventing President Trump from just being like, you know what, I'm going to sign an executive order that just completely, erases like Obergefell v. Hodges? Like, is that a thing that can be done and then it just happens? Like, does he have that ability, that power, as he's been signing all of these random executive orders? Is that a thing?
He could. He absolutely could. But would it have legal effect? No. Executive orders, you can't change the law. The executive enforces the laws as the legislator kind of passes them. So they write them and then the executive carries them out. What this entire presidency has tested is the ability for the executive branch to just not enforce or to overly enforce certain laws or enforce them in a different way. And that you can't prevent, right? So there are certain aspects of such an executive order that may, be attempted and will take them to court, ideally. The federal government could, potentially, based off of an executive order, try to deny people rights to their federal benefits if they're a federal employee. That would go to court and be challenged easily. But the executive can nowadays, at least under this administration, write anything it wants, right? There are so many executive orders that he's been writing that have literally no legal effect. They're just virtue signaling. But that happens, and that's what's been happening, and it's going to continue to happen for 4 years. But would it have legal effect? No, absolutely not. The president can't unilaterally override the Supreme Court. They can choose, again, not to enforce parts of it. That's it.
And then so if, let's say, he did do an executive order like that, it would still have to go through the same process to reverse it, even if he didn't do some sort of executive order. It would still have to go through the chain of command and through all the different courts and whatnot.
Yeah, you would challenge it and it would be held invalid. A court would say this isn't, constitutional. We have this entire framework. We have Obergefell in the way. We've got the Respect for Marriage Act. We've got no more Windsor in place. So the states also have their own rights. You can't do this on a federal level and just invalidate marriage. Because, that's the same path it took to get to where it is now, right? It went up to the Supreme Court, so it would have to do the same thing. But it would not be the kind of challenge that would suddenly result in, marriage.
Like an overnight change. Right. No, okay. Well, that's good to know. So, okay.
Yeah.
Green card.
There would be
still valid. Yes. Okay. Got it. Are there any warning signs? Is there anything that you're aware of as an attorney? Because I'm sure you see and hear a lot of things that I am and a lot of us are probably unaware of. Is there any whispers or anything?
You're 100% right. That there are definitely some whispers. If I had a sound effects pack, I'd be sounding an alarm right now, just going crazy. There are so many signs. And Dobbs, the Roe v. Wade kind of repealed a case that made it unconstitutional and returned it back to the states. That case had a really interesting, what I'll call it, concurrence, which means that one of the justices said, like, I agree with what this court is doing, based off the votes of the majority. But I also want to write my own little separate note here so people can listen to me, because everybody loves, listening to themselves. So in that little concurring opinion, Justice Clarence Thomas, he's one of the older justices. He wrote his own concurring opinion, and it's so meta, okay? It's V-meta, because he is calling for overturning precedent, specifically Obergefell, in an opinion that was overturning precedent, which was Dobbs and, Roe v. Wade. So it's a serious concern, and he's quoting himself the entire time, just so you know, in his entire opinion. He just goes back and quotes himself from dissents, from old opinions that he's had. And as silly and insane as that looks, it's also, again, very meta, because he was once a dissent, and now he got his way, right? He's now in the majority. He's overturning Roe v. Wade. And so while that may be laughable, at some point that could become the majority, and that's horrifying. He goes into this opinion, and let me tell you. So you kind of need to understand a little bit about the law, and I'll try not to bore you too much, but basically there are two types of due process. Due process is like your fundamental constitutional right? It's guaranteed by the 5th and 14th Amendment, and it says that you have to be given due process before deprived of life, liberty, or property, okay? And the way courts have interpreted that is that there are really two kinds. There's one, which is procedural due process, and that means you need to have the right, steps in place for somebody to go through a legal process. You can't say, oh, you have 1 day to answer something that, would take an average person like 20 days to write. So there are certain things you have to promise people. The process has to go this way. They have to know what they're being accused of in the criminal world, things like that, right? But there's a second kind of due process that's substantive due process. And that means no matter what process you give somebody, it doesn't matter. You can't rob them of that right, It's kind of like some people would say that there are certain fundamental rights that are just inherent to us. Like, we wouldn't allow the government to take away from us at all, no matter what kind of procedure they give them. And what both Dobbs and Obergefell have in common is that they're both based in the second type of due process. They say that privacy that a woman has to make decisions over her body in Roe v. Wade, that's what that basis was right there. It was substantive due process. And Obergefell said the same thing. There's something inherent, something you've spent your entire life with somebody. We all deserve that opportunity to be with our loved one in the hospital room. And so that human component of it is entirely stripped away in Justice Thomas's concurrence. He says that second kind of due process shouldn't exist. Absolutely. You should be able to implement any procedure you want. You could take away anything. So that means he wants to be able to take away your life, your liberty, any property that you own, as long as they give you a fair process. That's really all that matters, is that procedural part, according to him. And if the legislator passes a law that says you can be put to death because of, XYZ thing for littering, it doesn't matter as long as we gave you a hearing and we convicted you, you're good to go. And so he doesn't want that. And he names all of these cases that he says that the court should reconsider in the future. And, he's just one justice, so his opinion doesn't really have any legal effect. But like I mentioned, one day he could be quoting himself, and it could be valid at that point if the majority gets strong enough. But he calls out cases like Griswold, which is a Supreme Court case that made access to contraception, you couldn't ban it. It, made that unconstitutional. Same thing with Lawrence v. Texas, private consensual acts between adults, and Obergefell, marriage equality. But the funny thing, and I have to point this out every time, is that he leaves one case out. And that case is called Loving v. Virginia. That case made interracial marriages legal.
Right.
You couldn't ban it.
Right.
I
thought that's where you're going.
He would leave that one out. The man that's in an interracial marriage himself doesn't want that one case that is entirely a substantive due process case, He doesn't want it reconsidered. It is odd.
Oh, good Lord. Well, I understood about 43% of what you just said, but when I go back and edit, hopefully I'll absorb the rest of it. But I feel like a lot of, there's this very blurred line of church and state within all of this, because a lot of it has to do with, if my husband is sick in the hospital, now I can luckily go to the hospital with him because we have marriage equality. This may not make sense. It makes sense in my brain. But then when people are so up in arms about it because they're really religious and they don't want us to have, marriage equality, then it's like, but some of us are just doing it so we can life insurance or medical insurance or, things sharing a home together, taxes, like those are all like state level things. You know what I'm saying? Does that make sense? But then
Yeah,
people
yeah.
that are religious are just preventing us from experiencing the rights that are not just putting a ring on a finger and not just having a wedding and whatnot. So is that not like a wildly blurred line between church and state when it comes to this marriage equality issue? I
I
probably
think
didn't
you're
say that very
100%
eloquently,
right.
but
No, but
I
I
think you
think
get
you're
what I'm
getting at a
saying.
valid point. Yeah, no, exactly right. And I think what I would say to those people is you need to recognize that the logic there is flawed because you're saying I can impose my religion on other people. My religion says no, anything besides a man and woman in a marriage is not lawful. But the only reason you're getting to push that on everyone else is because you believe that you're in the majority. Now, let's say a Muslim group comes into the majority and they suddenly come into power. You're saying you're fine with their religion being pushed on you. And if your answer is no, then that contradiction means that you only believe that your religion should be imposed on everyone else. And that's
Right.
not in the Constitution, right? So, unless you're okay with the other people's religion being forced upon you when the time comes that you're not in the majority, you should be as upset about this as everyone else. Because the problem is that if you're not lining up with that person's religion that's in power, you're going to be deprived of fundamental rights like paying your taxes, like you said, seeing your loved one in the hospital. And there is a difference between these two things. Their mistake is blurring the two together and saying the
Right.
marriage certificate I get is the same as my marriage religion. No, it's not. If you believe in a
Right.
higher being, that piece of paper means nothing.
Are you religious?
It's complicated. I would say I am agnostic. I believe in a higher being. My views tend to be somewhat Christian aligned at times, but I also studied in a Buddhist temple for 3 years from when I was 14 to 17. And I think that religion is really beautiful. It has a lot of good tenets about finding like self happiness. And if you get your own stuff right and you get your life together, then you help everyone else basically by finding
Right.
that inner happiness. And I like that because, like to your point earlier, I don't like judging other people. I don't like attacking other people and trying to force them to take on my views. That part really disturbs me. But do I believe in a God? Absolutely. I've seen too many ugly things in this world to not believe that in the times that got me through it, that there wasn't something there pushing me.
Right.
So,
Right.
what about you?
I didn't. What about me? I've gone through a bunch of different religions. In grade 7, I used to be really religious. I used to bring my Bible to school, but I went to public school, and I used to go to church with my music teacher. And shockingly, I used to be like, nobody can swear around me. I like swear words. No, you're bad. You're a sinner. And now every other word out of my mouth is a fucking swear word. But in growing, I definitely believe in a higher power. I'm the type of person who's like, when I pray, I like talk to the universe or talk to something. But I definitely, I don't go to church. I'm not really wrapped up in, although I was baptized, but I do believe in a higher power. I just always think about how many religions there are and how many different gods there are and how many different systems of belief, and people that are so hung up on theirs being right and being the only one always blows my mind. And I'm like, if you want to believe in Jesus and you want to believe in the Bible and that type of God, go for it. I don't, but that's my choice. But then, when people push it on you, like you were saying, is when I get a little bit like perturbed and
Yeah,
uncomfortable.
especially for us queer people, right? We were told, I remember sitting 14 years old in a church and hearing, being told that I was the devil and that I was going to burn in hell for the rest of my
Yeah.
life. And, it's very tough for us to get close to our religions, I think, because of that. We've had
Right.
horrible experiences. So I don't blame you one
Yeah.
bit. It's a journey, it's a process.
And not to mention, the religious folk who come to Pride with their signs saying that we're all going to burn in hell. That's really nice. That's what a real
Yeah.
Christian would do, don't you think?
Well, look, if we're going to burn in hell, it looks like it's going to be a great time, honestly. If you look at Pride,
I mean,
it's always
truthfully,
fun.
it's just going to be Pride while we're all burning in
Exactly.
hell together. It's
It'll be
just
Pride
all
in
the
Texas.
gays. Fuck yes, I'm here for it. Okay, we're going to shift along here. Gay marriage, wasn't the only thing on my mind. I've been thinking a lot about, or previously, because I am that bitch that watches The View, and they always talk about Project 2025, and, for a period of time, that was something that Trump claimed he knew nothing about, and was not involved in, and, was like, I've never seen it, I've never read over it, and then as they start to implement all of these pieces of Project 2025, the last thing, or one of the last things they haven't done basically, is the marriage equality thing. That's on their list to revisit marriage equality. Are there any like upcoming bills beyond marriage equality, trans rights, which we know are being stripped away. Is there anything that's on your radar within Project 2025 or outside of that? Just any bills, any laws, any type of restrictions beyond what we might already be hearing about in the news?
This is a great question. Like I said earlier, I think there are so many other rights that we should be concerned about on top of the marriage part. So great question. And yes, it does terrify me, especially because a lot of people who voted that way justified it saying, well, he didn't know about that. I'm not going to harm you because I'm not voting for that. That's a separate thing. But as you mentioned, a lot of it has mirrored the actions, and that's very true. There are really attacks coming from all sides right now. You have the executive orders, like you mentioned, and some of them do have power, right? The kinds of ones that seem to be within the purview of the executive branch right now are like the State Department being told via executive order, no more issuing passports with transgenders, like actual recognized gender on them. No more of that. Federal agencies are removing gender identity from forms. They're erasing us. And that's important and significant because, right, as I mentioned earlier, marriage equality, it's all about framing. And that side of people, the really hateful side, they're really good at framing things sometimes in a way that make people feel like they have to get behind something. And what they're really doing is they're trying to erase us so that we're not human, we're not recognized, and then it becomes that much easier to dehumanize us later and, do things like put us in jail or whatever it may be back to Lawrence v. Texas. But right now, yeah, we're being attacked from several states. I mean, some states are trying on purpose to get Obergefell overturned by passing, like in Texas or Oklahoma and Tennessee, covenant marriage bills. That's affecting the marriage part of it. Some of them are banning trans athletes in sports. We obviously have Florida's Don't Say Gay law, right? Like, again, erasing us from history, erasing us and our humanity so that when people learn about LGBT folks, it's the first time they're ever hearing about it. And if they never hear about it up until that point, it's so much easier to dehumanize us and to lock us up and throw us away. We've had drag bans, it's countless things. And there's so much more, like you said, that they could be doing and that they plan to do. If you read Project 2025, they have a dream list in there and it's other things like the ACA. They want to repeal part of it that requires any protection for gender identity, any sexual orientation stuff, all that. So that is on their list. They also want to remove the employment protections part, right? So if you think about how there was a Supreme Court case about that, they want you to be able to be fired because you're gay. And on top of that, we're also seeing like some other types of funding being stripped away from schools. They want to try to say if you're supporting LGBT folks or supporting trans athletes, we're not going to give you your Title 9 funding at all. You're not going to get any of that. So yeah, it's very real.
Great. Another positive input. It's fucking terrifying. I think it's really easy to forget about all of these things because there's so many of them. Like Don't Say Gay, that was, a big thing. But then something else comes out on the news and it distracts us. And when you lay it out there like that long list of things, it's even more terrifying and makes it feel even more serious. Yeah.
It's called flooding the zone. They want to overwhelm you, Josh. They want you to sit at home and just be like, oh my God, everyone's under attack.
Well, they're doing a great fucking job at it.
So we need to do better.
Good job. Yes, focus. I need to take more Adderall so I can remember all of these things. So yeah, my next point was, DEI rollbacks, legal discrimination, the fact that can I not now be fired from my job for being gay?
So right now you can't. That's not the case. Okay. There's a Supreme Court case that people were really shocked about. It was, I think like 2 years ago that happened. And basically that recognized employment protections at the federal level. And so similar to like Obergefell, right? It said you can't discriminate against people based off of their gender identity or sexual orientation. So you are protected from your employment stuff. But a lot of states are employment at will, and you really don't need a reason. And so some of these states, they'll come up with reasons. You've been there probably before where somebody gives you some BS reason and you know what's up. So yeah, that's real. But you also mentioned earlier, right? There are ways that like people don't have to provide services for LGBT folks. So there are ways that like legal discrimination is still happening.
I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize. Like when I talk to my family, they think specifically California is so progressive and Democrats and everyone loves the gays. And like, I'm like, it's still the United States of America and it's pretty red in a multitude of areas. But I don't think a lot of people, even allies, friends that I have here, friends that grew up in the United States, I don't think they realize those daily battles that we have. Like if I had a wedding, which I didn't have one, but if I went and wanted to get a cake, that person has the right to tell me, no, I'm not going to make you a cake because you're gay. All of our straight friends don't have to worry about that. And nor do I really think that they think about it quite as often, which is part of the reason I want to talk about it more. There's a lot of things that people just think because it applies to them as straight couples or straight friends or straight family members that it applies to us. And it's vastly different.
But maybe they should be worried, Who the hell is out there decorating cakes but gay people, Like, what if I refuse to cut y'all's hair?
True.
Okay? You're going to look a mess, all of you, with your
We
mullets.
should. We should.
It'd be horrible, and we don't want that. Nobody
denying.
wants that,
No. It's
That's
not
the
that
point.
deep. It's just a cake. It's just sugar and calories. Just make the fucking cake. It's ridiculous. Okay, you keep saying LGBT, but I always say LGBTQ plus. Is this new?
No, everybody says
Does it matter?
different things. I'm certain there are people that would be upset that I didn't say that, and I mean no offense by it. It's just easier. I don't like the categorization of people. I like calling it the queer community. It's far easier. But, some people want every single letter shouted out, and, respect to those people. It's hard to do that sometimes and remember it. And then you're
It's
also
a tongue twister.
not acknowledging people. There are other groups outside of that. So I mean it to be all inclusive. Make no mistake.
Love it. Okay. I like calling it just the queer community.
Yeah.
Because when I try to say the LGBTQ plus community, it's like
But then people say, well, what about the allies? You're
bumble over
excluding
my
them,
words. Yeah.
We need to be nicer
somebody's
about these things. We're under
unfortunately
attack.
always going to be excluded.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So the queer community, defunding a lot of healthcare for trans people, not a lot of, all of, and they are not allowed to serve in the Navy, this and that. And then when I see things pop up about specifically HIV and AIDS, defunding for all of those different causes, I'm like, are they just going to take our PrEP away? Is that likely possibility? Because I go through Mister and I get it free because I don't have health care because it's wildly expensive and my jobs don't offer it. So it's cheaper for me to fly back to Canada, honestly, to go to a doctor than it is to go to a doctor here. And if I'm like, I don't understand how Trump has, taken away that funding from HIV and AIDS research specifically, but can you elaborate on, if you do know, like what that looks like for these different foundations, or where the funding was going and now they're not getting any? How will that trickle down and affect us?
Yeah, that great question. It's a very real one for a lot of people, and it's being attacked as well from all sides. When you specifically think about HIV AIDS, there is about $258 million allocated in the federal budget for studying for the HIV vaccine that they've been developing. You've probably heard whispers about it. It's in the same kind of phases that PrEP was back in the day, Before that was happening, the disease was running rampant. But PrEP has helped, mitigate all of that. And it would be the same way with the vaccine someday. Ideally, we would eradicate it. But that takes time. That takes money. Think of the COVID vaccine, right? Like, that took years to develop. And that was a kind of national priority that was really well funded, and that there was a lot of social momentum and pressure behind. Most vaccines are not even developed that quickly, but that one was. And so this vaccine, having all that research pulled, means that that vaccine will probably never, materialize, especially not anytime in the future. That means people who had, been studying for their PhDs in microbiology or virology, they probably had their funding for their projects pulled. And those people have to now find new areas that they can find funding in. It affects people at a very rudimentary level, but they are going for things like PrEP. In fact, there is a Supreme Court case that most people don't talk about, but it's pending right now before the Supreme Court. The decision will come out any day now. It's called Kennedy versus Braidwood. And that actually started back in Texas, my home state. And what it effectively was is, you probably remember Hobby Lobby, or most of your viewers do, or listeners do. Back with Hobby Lobby, right, they took away contraception and certain types of pregnancy care that the employer said was like not preferred by their religion. And so they said, I don't want to have to offer that to my employees. But the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare as most people refer to it, that made it such that employers had to provide you. They said, here are the minimum things you have to provide somebody for healthcare if you're an employer plan. And so, they dictated that. Keep in mind, we're the only developed nation that privatizes healthcare and doesn't offer it, universally. But on top of that, we allow your employer to say, no, no, no. I get to impose my religion on you by saying, I don't want to pay for your abortion. I don't want to pay for your contraceptives. And so that exact same challenge has been repackaged in Kennedy versus Brady in Texas. An employer said, I don't want to pay for PrEP because it's for homosexual people to do sexual things, and my religion doesn't support that. And of course, there is a judge in Texas that said that sounds good to me, and that case is now pending before the Supreme Court, which is really shocking because, between 2018 and 2022, when PrEP started becoming widely available, HIV infections declined 12%. And we're going to see a huge reversal in that if that's the case. Okay. And with the vaccine being gone, I mean, that's people's lives that could have been saved in the future, right? That won't have the opportunity of getting that vaccine.
And you think this is a direct statement on their views of the queer community? They're not doing it because they're trying to cut budget. They're doing it because they don't like us.
No, it's the same reason that they did the abortion thing, right? They don't want to provide contraceptives. It's about imposing your religion on somebody else, as I mentioned, right? Think about the next religion. They say, well, I believe that when you and this is true for some religions. Like I believe Jehovah's Witnesses are like this. That if your body is subject to cancer or something, that you shouldn't be treated because that's what God's plan is. So if somebody like that came into power, and they got to impose their religion, would you be okay with that? If your daughter was dying, your son was dying with cancer, and the doctor said, I can't give them chemo because we now live in a society where the majority has voted that you don't get to do that because it's God's plan. That person was meant to die. Your child was meant to die. That would be such a dark place to live in, but that's effectively what they're doing here. They're attacking it so that people don't have to provide that.
And I'm sure if that did happen, everyone who is, would not be very happy about that if the tables were turned. And
exactly.
I mean, maybe we should turn the tables on them and give them a little taste of their own medicine.
I mean, that's what people need to think about long term. Treat others the way you want to be treated.
Kayla's oldest time. Okay. I'm going to kind of rewind real quick back to the very top. Is there anything that same-sex couples can do now to protect their marriage and their right to be married? Is there anything in preparation should the whole world blow up? Is there something that they can do?
Yeah. So obviously I have to give a caveat. I can't give anybody legal advice. They should always take their own lawyer's legal advice or seek out legal help.
But I can though.
But thinking about it large, there's certain things we all have to do. Like we have to vote, right? Obviously get out and vote for those candidates. And, gay people, since the marriage equality case, have become honestly a little bit apathetic. And I don't think that's the right move. I personally still vote. I'm very active on that. So be educated, vote, stay aware. There will be warning signs. Do they need to do things right now necessarily? That's up to them. But you will start hearing about a case making its way to the Supreme Court if you stay, in tune to the news about reversing Obergefell at some point. And when you start hearing that, you definitely should start moving because that means that a protection may come down soon, Something may get toppled by the Supreme Court. And the things that people can do now or whenever they start hearing news like that is updating their will, their estate plans. Make sure that if you have a partner, even though they're married and you live in a common law state, you want to probably make sure that those things are enshrined in that plan so that people know what your wishes are and so that, a family that maybe disagrees with the way you were born won't be able to stop that from happening. The other thing is you can get a power of attorney form. It depends on certain states. They have different ways of doing it, but somebody, can sign something to basically allow that person into the hospital room should that person, become incapacitated and marriage no longer be acknowledged by that state, and updating your beneficiaries too on your life insurance policy, things like that, to again make sure that your husband or wife gets what you think that they deserve. And the last thing you can do is get involved, right? So there is going to be a No Kings protest on June 14th nationwide. There's going to be several in San Diego where we live. So I would encourage people to participate in those peaceful protests and just get out there, get your voice heard, speak about these things, because when people see that there are others that believe the same things they do, they will get up, they will move. And that's what the other side is very good at doing, is communicating and mobilizing. Mm-hmm. So get on your feet.
I find it really interesting how many people I know that didn't vote and how many people are unaware of even just, the National Guard being in LA right now. They're very out of touch. And I think it's easy to bury your head in the sand because there's so much, like we said, what did you call it? Flooding the something or other.
Flooding the zone.
Flooding the zone. The zone is flooded, you know? Like, there's so much shit going on, and it's stressful turning on the TV. It's stressful watching the news. Twitter is a fucking hellscape, but I still go through it. Sometimes I get way too deep down that rabbit hole, and it gets real dark. But I think it's so important now, especially for the people who do not want to be made aware, to be aware. Because I can't vote, but I know that a lot of my straight female friends did not vote. And so I would love for them to vote on my behalf. You know, eventually once I am a citizen, I will be able to. But not voting is so fucking crazy to me. And millions of people didn't vote in this last election, right?
Yeah. People have to
I forget the number. I heard it the other
too.
day, but yeah.
You know, they've got to have a reason to vote.
Right.
And they need to hear from you. They need to know that their friends are under attack. And my advice to you would be, I get it. Like, it's very overwhelming. Like I said, that is the point, flooding the zone. So what you can do to combat that is you can give yourself rest days. You know, if you don't, like for me, typically on the weekends, I'm not as in tune to the news. Every morning when I'm getting up on a weekday, though, I typically listen to NPR while I'm in the shower or something. Is it super depressing? Of course, right? But it's an isolated 10, 15 minutes where I can listen, I can get motivated, understand the issues. Maybe you need something even more, you know, with further distance than that. Maybe you only do one day that you start looking at the news, or you only look at specific kinds of news, like affecting the LGBT community or whatever is important to you. But here's the thing, don't zone out. Like, don't get away from it all. Don't think it's all going to work out, because it's not going to work out. It's not working out right now for the people, the families being ripped apart. You know, it's not working out for the trans athletes that are being, you know, sidelined and treated horribly and being murdered. This doesn't really work if we don't work together. And so you can do your part as you're able and as you can, but you have to do something. And I think that's the key.
Yeah. I think it's easy to be unaware until it affects you, but it would be ideal for us all to be aware before it has to affect us, so we can take action and make change before it even comes to us. I think a lot of my friends, and myself actually, that's why I'm doing this episode and the podcast, because I think, you know, until things have started to affect me, I was like, oh, I should pay a bit more attention. Now I pay too much attention, but yeah. So let's end on a positive note, Mario. Something just random. What gives you hope lately? What gives you hope right now in these crazy trying times? Because trust me, I find myself crying all the time when I listen to the podcast about Obergefell v. Hodges. Is that what it is? I keep forgetting the name.
You got
Terrible.
it. Nailed it.
I start tearing up. I'm listening to it on the treadmill, and it's like all this stuff feels so heavy. So what gives you hope in such a heavy time, especially in Pride Month?
Yeah, things are heavy, but you're right. It is Pride Month, and I keep my positivity alive because I think hope is all you can have sometimes. But it has gotten me like right through those really dark places. That's the reason I believe in a higher being personally. But what gets me going is really looking at like protests. Like, I went to a protest the other day and observed, and there were people out on the streets, and the passion, the community, the uniform sentiment, the mix of people of all different ages and races and genders, and just looking at that, seeing how emboldened they were. I mean, the streets were packed here, and this is San Diego. It's really hard to get people to mobilize because it's so beautiful and they live such a chill life that getting them in the streets is just so tough. But watching the passion and the people go and fight, and it just is incredible. And that's what gives me hope. You know, seeing opportunities like this on this podcast where we're talking about these issues and approaching them, that gives me hope. Seeing other people talking about those issues, knowing that I'm not alone in that belief and that we will make it past this. We will, but it's going to take work, because what they've been doing, they've been planning this stuff for years, right?
Yeah.
Justice Thomas wrote that years ago, that concurring opinion, and he was citing his dissent opinions from decades before. And so people need to realize it's a long game. We didn't get here quickly, and so it's going to be a long game to protect this stuff, and it's going to always be going. Yes, you get your moments of rest. Yes, you get to go out there and have fun, but you also got to put some work in, you know? And remember, too, sometimes joy, especially this Pride Month, joy is an act of resistance. So getting out there, being in your pride parade, twerking and having fun, I mean, that in and of itself is also sometimes protest.
I saw something the other day that was, I think it was a little commercial, well, reel on Instagram, but it was about somebody wearing a rainbow like bracelet or something, and they were saying that is a form of protest and that is a form of pride and just outwardly putting yourself out there. And I don't think I've ever owned a rainbow anything, just because I think it makes me feel very vulnerable. And like, I mean, I always am like, am I gonna get shot on my walk home, like from the grocery store? It's not unheard of, things are happening. But after I saw that, I was like, it is a protest. You're like expressing that you're here to stay, and you're gonna be a part of the fight. And now I'm just gonna go by rainbow everything.
Hey, good
I'm
plan.
only wearing
that's why
rainbow
they're
moving
removing
forward.
us. That's why they're removing us from forums. They don't want us to be visible. They want us to be hidden,
Right.
so people can just alienate us. And so I think that's a great plan, getting out there and being visible. And that is a protest, right? One time I was with my husband at our gym in our old building when we lived in Texas, and he wore a rainbow bandana while he was in the gym, sweating, lifting way more than that guy was lifting. And some dude just came up to him and just went off, and it was so shocking, but he was so uncomfortable with the fact that he was wearing something rainbow. So it is an act of protest, and you should absolutely do that, Josh. I'm here for it. I'll support fully.
I'm gonna do it. I love it. Aren't you wearing like a rainbow outfit to Disney Pride Day or whatever?
Oh, definitely.
Okay.
Definitely.
I'm gonna need to
Something
get
colorful.
something. Wear rainbows. Stand up for yourself. Protest.
Stand up for your
show
friends.
up. Stand up for your friends who maybe can't vote. That would be super cute and helpful. Is there anything else you want to add to this? Is there anything you'd like to end this on?
No, I hope people keep up the fight. Remember, Pride started as a protest. Your recent episode kind of explains some of that. Viewers should go check it out, But thanks, Josh, for having me. It's been a fun conversation, despite some of the sad stuff. But like I said, there's still a lot of hope, Boo.
Well, thank you for letting me pick your smart brain. I aim to speak as eloquently as you one day. I will go read a dictionary and revisit all of your legal jargon. But anyway, thank you so much for
good
being
chatting.
here.